Walt Whitman's poem, "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed," is a poignant and profound meditation on the grief, loss, and mourning following the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. The poem blends Whitman's personal sorrow with his broader reflections on death, democracy, and the human experience. The poem opens with an image of lilacs blooming in the dooryard, symbolizing both the beauty of spring and the sadness of mourning. The lilacs are a central symbol throughout the poem, representing both the presence of life and the inevitability of death. Whitman uses the bloom of the flowers to set the stage for his exploration of loss, as the lilacs are linked to the grief he feels following Lincoln's death. Whitman immediately acknowledges the death of Lincoln and the national tragedy it represents. Lincoln's assassination has left the nation in mourning, and Whitman's grief is not just personal but collective, as he speaks for the nation's sorrow. He uses the lilacs as a metaphor for the death of the leader, intertwining the imagery of the flowers with the spirit of Lincoln. Whitman's grief is raw and powerful, reflecting the profound impact Lincoln's death had on both the poet and the country as a whole. As the poem progresses, Whitman embarks on a journey of mourning, both physical and spiritual. He reflects on the process of grief, which moves through stages of denial, sorrow, and eventual acceptance. The poet contemplates the role of the mourners, who must reconcile themselves to the death of a leader who embodied the ideals of the nation. Through this journey, Whitman examines the deeper emotional and existential questions that arise from the loss of such a figure. His grief is not just for the death of Lincoln, but also for the death of an era of hope and unity in the United States. The lilacs themselves take on a larger symbolic meaning in the poem, representing both the passage of time and the cyclical nature of life and death. Whitman contrasts the blooming of the lilacs with the star that has fallen from the heavens, symbolizing the death of a leader. The star is also a metaphor for Lincoln's guidance and the light he provided to the nation, which has now been extinguished. The lilacs, though beautiful, are tied to a sense of loss, as they mark the passage of time and the inevitable end of life. Their bloom is bittersweet, as it represents both renewal and the fleeting nature of existence. Whitman places himself in the position of the poet-mourner, using his voice to express the collective grief of the nation. He speaks as a representative of the people, not just as an individual, acknowledging the shared sorrow of the country. The poem becomes a space for communal mourning, as Whitman's voice echoes the collective sadness of the American public. His role as a poet is to give voice to the emotions that cannot be fully expressed through words alone, to articulate the grief that transcends the personal and touches the collective soul. The funeral procession that takes place in the poem is a central image in Whitman's elegy. The poem describes the somber journey of the deceased's body, from Washington, D.C., to its final resting place. This journey of the funeral procession becomes a symbolic representation of the journey of the soul, moving from the earthly realm to the spiritual one. Whitman meditates on the rituals of death, seeing them as a way for the living to honor and remember the dead. The procession is also a reflection of the American people's deep respect for Lincoln, as they participate in the collective act of mourning. Music plays a significant role in the poem, with Whitman evoking the sound of the funeral march as part of the funeral procession. The music serves as a means of emotional expression, amplifying the grief and sorrow of the mourners. Whitman reflects on how music, with its power to stir the soul, helps to give voice to the inexpressible feelings that accompany loss. The use of music in the poem also underscores the spiritual dimension of the mourning process, as the mournful tones are seen as a form of transcendence, carrying the soul of Lincoln to a higher plane. Throughout the poem, Whitman emphasizes the idea that nature itself is responding to Lincoln's death. The mourning is not confined to human beings alone, but extends to the natural world as well. Whitman suggests that the birds, the trees, and the flowers all participate in the collective sorrow, as they, too, are affected by the loss. The natural world is portrayed as being deeply intertwined with the human experience, with death marking a disruption in the harmony of life. As Whitman moves through his grief, he envisions the spirit of Lincoln, suggesting that death does not mark the end of existence, but rather the continuation of the soul in a different form. Whitman imagines Lincoln's soul as a guiding force, continuing to inspire and lead even in death. This vision of Lincoln's spirit represents the poet's belief in the enduring power of the individual's influence, even after physical death. The poem takes on a spiritual dimension as Whitman reflects on the idea of immortality and the persistence of the soul beyond the grave. In the final stanzas of the poem, Whitman moves toward a resolution, suggesting that mourning is a necessary part of the human experience but that it is ultimately followed by renewal. The lilacs, which bloom every year, symbolize the cyclical nature of life and death, suggesting that while Lincoln's death is a significant loss, it is also part of a larger process of growth and regeneration. Whitman ultimately finds comfort in the idea that death is not an end, but a transformation. The poet's acceptance of death, coupled with his vision of renewal, offers a sense of hope and continuity, even in the face of profound loss.